Hell, welcome back to the Lit Professor. I just want to follow up on my the video I did on Vanka, Chekhov's Vanka, worse than a dog's life. Couldn't really leave it like that. I couldn't leave it where I left it off because it just wasn't right to do so. I essentially felt after I did that, and I did it. The reason I left it like that, where I essentially portrayed Vanka as a victim. And the reason I did that is because he's like I imagine him as being like a 5, 6, 7 year old little kid. I mean, literally, a grade school age kid. This really fairly helpless kid. It's not like it's an adult here, and uh, and so really he was kind of in a victim. He was a victim of child abuse. I mean, we don't the word victim is of course overused, and I think that creates the victim mentality in many people. So that's why it troubled me. But on the other hand, he was just a little kid, and I don't know, that you can blame a little kid who really hasn't just fell off the Apple truck here and just showed up and hasn't learned any life coping skills, perhaps. Although he does make a pretty sharp move when he sends that letter off. So I wanted to follow up with that because he had options. He had one option, which perhaps, yeah, he probably didn't know this. In fact, I would say most adults wouldn't even many. I wouldn't say most, but I would say many adults wouldn't even think of this. But he had one clue that could have given him an invincible mindset, and so he could have transformed from the victim mindset into the have an indomitable mindset. Now that's a lot to ask for a little 5 or 6 year old kid, um, but Chekhov left it with him, having sent off this letter as a poor victim, and then going to sleep and hoping that grandfather comes, and maybe he does, but based on the description of the grandfather, it doesn't sound especially promising. It certainly could happen. So I just want to follow up with what could have happened, an alternate ending to the story. Let's say, for example, that little Vanka had read the Bible, and let's say he had read the story of Joseph, the little boy who had his brothers sold him into slavery, and I mean, they threw him in a pit and were going to leave him to die, and then they some Egyptian traders happened by, and so they sold him into slavery, and he was taken to Egypt and made a slave of the Pharaoh. So if there's anyone who ever you know would have an excuse to call himself a victim, you could say, well, that's Joseph. I mean, his brothers threw him in a pit, and then they sold their own brother into slavery. This, by the way, is a historical story. It's a true story. So that's pretty bad. So you could almost imagine that someone like that could maybe get depressed. Maybe they'd see, why me? Why does this kind of thing happen to me? But that's not what happened at all. And he too was a little boy, but he had a different sort of mindset. He had an invincible mindset. He was a boy. He was a little boy, but he was a boy of faith, and he believed, and he served. He was a highly moral, and he served the Pharaoh very diligently, and he was highly competent. He was very diligent, and he was talented, and he the young the Pharaoh's wife found him attractive and tried to seduce him, and he knew it was wrong, and so he said no. He said, no, no, get away from me. However, this outraged the Pharaoh's wife, that she should be rejected by a servant, and so she was furious, and so she made up a lie that he tried to rape her or seduce her, and so the Pharaoh now is furious. He throws the boy Joseph into prison. So now we've got this little boy. Not only was he, sold into slavery by his brothers, but now he's been lied about and he's in prison. I mean, this guy's got everything going wrong for him, right? or does he? So in prison, he was in prison with another servant who had ended up in prison from the Pharaoh, and he interpreted a dream for him. This was a talent. Joseph used his talents. He interpreted a dream, and then when this guy got out, the other guy got out of prison, Joseph goes, look, tell the Pharaoh about me. Tell him I'm innocent, And so don't forget about me. And so the guy goes, oh, don't worry, I'll tell him. But then the guy goes out and he forgets. So once again, Joseph is let down by his fellow man, his fellow prisoner, his what do they call them, roomies or whatever. So, but then a couple of years later, the Pharaoh had a dream and he needed someone to interpret it, and nobody could interpret it. And then this other servant goes, wait a minute, I know this guy in prison and he might be able to help. So they get Joseph out of prison, and Joseph comes and he interprets the dream brilliantly for the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh once again recognizes his talent, and he promotes Joseph. And Joseph becomes very promptly the prime minister of Egypt. So he's the second most powerful man in Egypt. He's running the country. He's running Egypt. Okay? This little boy who was the victim is suddenly running. He's suddenly the greatest power in Egypt. He's running the country. And so how does this happen? How did this happen? It happened because he was thrown in a pit by his jealous brothers, who not only hated him enough to throw him in a pit and leave him to die, but then sold him into slavery to some random Egyptians on camels passing by. And then because he was betrayed by the Pharaoh's wife and thrown into prison for something, just for trying to do the right thing. And then the one person who he begged to remember him forgot about him for 2 years. So how did he become the ruler of Egypt? He became the ruler of Egypt because of one piece of horrible, cruel twists of fate after another, 4 times in a row. I mean, enough to destroy many people. And this made him, these were like dominoes falling over. And the last domino was Joseph as king of Egypt. Or he's not the king, he's the prime minister of Egypt. And so, how does this apply to Vanka? Well, Vanka's had some, he's also, in a bad situation. Here he is, this little boy, and he's being beaten by these. Let's just a quick refresher here, because we may have someone who didn't hear the other video. Yesterday, he's this little boy, right? Christmas Eve, he's writing a desperate letter to his grandfather. Dear grandfather, yesterday I was given a thrashing. The master dragged me by the hair into the yard and beating me with a stirrup. That's a big, thick leather strap. Just literally flogging the kid. Because when I was rocking the baby, I fell asleep. And he goes on. He says, later on, he says, dear grandfather, please, for God's sake, take me away from here. Take me to the village. It's more than I can bear. It's more than I can bear. This kid is at the edge of his wits, and we can't take that seriously. We cannot overlook those kind of statements in today's society. When people say it's more than I can bear, that's a big concern, because they may mean it. Or at least in their psychology, they may believe that, even if it's not true. I kneel down before you. I pray to God, keep you forever, but take me away from here, or I shall die. I shall die. That kind of victim mentality. I mean, this is just a little kid, but you get teenagers, you get adults. Other people have this same kind of victim mentality, and they buy into it. They reinforce that in their own mind, and they destroy their hope. There's no reason for that. There's no reason. Joseph took a different path, and he showed it. We're going to talk about in just a minute what happened with Joseph. I'll grind your snuff for you. So now he goes on to pray, say, look, I'll take care of you in your old age. And then the saddest part of this whole letter is when he says, come, dear grandfather, I beseech you for Christ's sake to take me from here. Have pity on me, a poor orphan. They are always beating me. I'm terribly hungry, so miserable I can't tell you, and always crying. The other day, the master hit me on the head. At last I fell down and thought I would never get up again. It's worse than a dog's life. It's worse than a dog's life. And what's he referring to? He's referring back to he's referring back to this this description he gave earlier of a dog's when he said more than once they just about broke his hind legs. Twice a noose was put around his neck. This is extreme stuff this kid is talking about. It's like, and every week he was beaten until he was only half alive, and yet he managed to survive. And he says, my life was worse than that, and I can't take it anymore. It's so this is the victim mentality that this kid have, and frankly, for this age kid, who could blame him? I mean, he hasn't been around long yet, and yet Joseph, who was another young boy, a boy of the faith, was able to amazingly, miraculously respond in ways that helped him almost transcend adversity and become the king of the prime minister of Egypt. And so one move that Vanka could make that could have transcended this story, so it doesn't become just another example of the victim mentality, but could become, let's say, an example of the victor mentality, would be to look at this in terms of, look at the story of Joseph. Let's say little Vanka got his hands on a Bible and read the story of Joseph, and he could say, you know what, this is God's, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That's a promise in the Bible. All things work together for good. And another one, in all things give thanks, for this is the will of God for you. God often, just like with Joseph, God often puts us in circumstances where we suffer. And why? He does it for our growth, and so that we can ultimately get to heaven, and so that we can ultimately grow and get stronger and be prepared to grow and get to heaven for at the end of our life. And so, and in the case of Joseph, God was working for his good. And all things work together for good with those who love God and are called according to his purpose. So God was, when he was thrown in that pit, things were working to good. So if Vanka could have the indomitable mindset, because he could go, you know what? Yeah, they beat me yesterday. Sure, the mistress rubbed fish all over my face, and they dragged me by my hair, and they whipped me with a stirrup strap. But all things work together for good with those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And I believe this is all working for my good. And so this little kid could, that alone, if he just told himself that, he might start looking for the opportunities. How is this working to my good? And maybe he'd find something. So this is something that applies to everybody. And what happens when we make that shift is we switch from the victim mentality to the victor mentality, and then our eyes are open when the opportunity shows up. Thanks for watching.